Welcome to Stoughton Spotlight. I'm your host, Jeffrey Pickette. On this episode, we'll be giving you an update on the Stoughton High building project. And I'm happy to have my two guests along with me on this episode. Tim Bonfatti, who is the President and the CEO of Compass Project Management, the owner's project manager for this building project, and TJ Recupero, who's the chairman of the Stoughton Board of Selectmen and is also doubling as the chair of the Stoughton High Building Committee. So Tim and TJ, thank you so much for joining me on this episode.
Thank you for having us.
Before we get started in our discussion, I'd like to run down a timeline of how we got to this point where the school building committee was formed for the Stoughton High building project and where an owner's project manager was chosen and selected and the significance of that move. So let's get started with the timeline, which although we're in 2015 right now and ground has not broken on this project, it won't for some time. This project really dates back all the way to late 2010. So as you can see from the timeline, in late 2010, early 2011, the school committee formed a feasibility study committee to explore the conditions of the school buildings in Stoughton and ultimately recommended that no additional money be spent on improvements to Stoughton High unless in cases of emergency repairs, and that a priority was placed on replacing or renovating the Stoughton High building, which dates back, the A building, all the way to 1923, and additions were put on the building in the 50s and 60s. So it's an old and aging building. Let's go to the next slide, where in October and November of 2011, a statement of interest was voted on and drafted and then voted on by the school committee and selectmen, and then ultimately in January of 2012 submitted to the Massachusetts School Building Authority. In May of 2012, town meeting approved funding for a feasibility study for the Stoughton High building project, which was a positive step in terms of moving the project along. However, Stoughton High hadn't been accepted into the MSBA's pipeline yet. And as we move on to our next slide, we see that there is a little bit of a setback here. In December of 2012, that statement of interest I referenced was not approved by the MSBA. So Stoughton, in March of 2013, had to resubmit the SOI for Stoughton High. Almost a year later, in January of 2014, this is a very pivotal date in this process, Stoughton was invited into the MSBA's eligibility period for this SHS project. This is akin to being welcomed into the building as opposed to just trying to get in. If you're going to use a sports analogy, Stoughton got to go into the batter's box with being invited to the eligibility period. In May of 2014, the MSBA approved Stoughton School Building Committee, which I referenced earlier at the top of this episode. Moving on to our next slide. In July of 2014, Stoughton met the requirements of the eligibility period and therefore was invited into the MSBA's capital pipeline and was allowed to move on to the feasibility study portion of this process. And we will be talking about that in much more detail as we go further along in this episode. In August of 2014, the first meeting of the Stoughton High Building Committee was held. And in December of 2014, the Stoughton High Building Committee conducted owner's project manager interviews with 4 different firms and ultimately selected Compass Project Management to be the OPM for this project. And you met, Tim, with the Stoughton High Building Committee in February at I believe it was the February 12th meeting of the Stoughton High Building Committee, and that's kind of where we are today. So let's just kind of get started with what is owner's project manager and the significance of that role in this project.
So an owner's project manager is the owner's representative. So we represent Stoughton in its dealings with the architect and the builder on the project. The owner's project management capacity or term is kind of reasonably new. The state started to require that all public projects have owners project managers in 2004. Because they were dealing with a lot of public projects that had gotten out of control. So what they found is that by appointing or by having a dedicated firm, or if it's a project small enough, person work for the owner's interest, we have a more predictable delivery of capital projects in the state. So we work for the town of Stoughton. We don't work for the builder. We don't work for the architect. We work for the town. Having said that, we do try to make sure we work collaboratively with the architect and the builder, because they are the people that are going to design and build the building. So a lot of what we do is making sure they understand what the town's position is, what the interests are, and making sure that they're all aligned. We also try to make sure that the project is predictable, and that as much as possible, the journey from today till the turnover of the keys to the school it doesn't have a lot of bumps and doesn't have a lot of hiccups. And so a lot of what we do is process generated, making sure that the building committee has enough information to make the decisions they need to make, making sure that the people on the team are accountable for what they're doing, both us and the other people that join the team, the builder and the architect. So that's and also that what we're doing is communicated, throughout the community in a transparent way. In this case with the MSBA, the third thing we do is with the MSBA projects, we are your liaison with the MSBA. So the MSBA counts on us to make sure that you understand, because they have a program that has some complexity to it, to make sure that we sort of navigate that complexity for Stoughton.
And TJ, what made Compass Project Management stand out to you at reviewing the 4 applicants and going through the 4 interviews back in December? What led you to select Compass?
Well, just a minor correction. I think we started with 14 people who submitted proposals to us.
You ultimately interviewed 4.
Right, we interviewed 4, and I can't speak for the entire committee, but I can tell you we were impressed with several things. First of all, we ran the gamut between big company and small company, and Tim came in front of us with his team, loved the team approach, his entire team, and gave us an outline of a project that was very personal. He was saying, look, I'm going to be at every, and he has, since we've only had 2 since choosing the OPM, but was going to be personally responsible for the project, beginning to end. And that was very important to us, that we had someone who was personally vested in the project, as opposed to a large company that would come in and we wouldn't know who we would be getting and running our project for us. The other thing is, too, the references for Compass Project Management were just impeccable. They were glowing. Everywhere Compass has worked, the references we got back, and there were several people calling for references, they were all glowing. So in the end, it was an overwhelming vote.
And let's talk a little bit about the committee, just to inform everybody the makeup of the committee. You serve as the chair, TJ,
Right.
And the committee is made up of different town employees and residents. There's a representative from the school committee. There's Maureen Doherty, who is the procurement officer. The town manager and the superintendent sit on the committee. There's Principal Mike Connolly from Mansfield High School. Right. So just kind of give me a rundown of this committee.
Well, the positions on the committee were largely slotted. It wasn't, going to the community at large looking for anybody who was interested in the high school project. That would have been easy. What we needed to do is find people with a certain profile to fit a certain slot that we wanted for, because the committee had to be approved by the MSBA. They had to. We submitted all the names. Everybody was vetted, and in the end, everybody was approved. So we have, there's a component from the school department. There's a component, actually, the principal of the high school is
Julie
there.
Miller's on the committee as
Right.
well.
Right, and then we do have, a couple of at-large members, Roberta Harback, who has actually worked on a school project for Southeastern Regional, so she's familiar with the process. She was an easy one to slot in. Chairman of the Finance Committee, Rick Hill, he brings in that financial component that we would need. And of course, the town manager, who was charged with, under the charter, with all of the town buildings and facilities. So.
And of course, Joel Harding, who's the
Joel Harding, he's the facilities manager for the high school, right?
for all of the schools. And so we'll bring up the slide of the influencers, just kind of show you the graph of how this all works with this Stoughton High Building Committee in the middle, and you have all of the players on the outside. So, Tim or TJ, just kind of walk me through this and how this dynamic works throughout the process.
Well, I'll take a crack at it and TJ can supplement it. But basically, a project like this, of this importance and of this size for a town, it's very important that the building committee and us as their representative be cognizant of the different kinds of people that need to understand the project and influence it, frankly. So obviously the MSBA, because they're a major financial contributor, need to be a critical part of that mix. There are the people like the architect and the builder who are actually going to be an important part of the delivery of the project. But then, the parents and the students, we through the course of the project engage with parents and students in a collaborative way to make sure that this is a great adventure as well, and a great opportunity for people to learn, students in particular at the high school level, to participate in a project and start to see what building a major capital project looks like. Taxpayers of Stoughton are going to be obviously very interested in how this project develops, so it's important we communicate with them. Abutters, one of the things we pride ourselves as being very proactive with abutters to make sure that they're not unduly burdened by a project, because a construction project doesn't get built in a vacuum, and I'd love to say that it's just going to pop up, but it doesn't. It happens over the span of 2 or 3 years. So we're very conscious of abutters. And then naturally the staff of the school and the administration need to have a project in a building that represents their needs. So these are the kinds of influences we call on the project that we want to make sure that we're touching on, so that their needs are being addressed as much as sort of the standard on time, on budget delivery, that we're looking at this broader look at the project.
And with that in mind, let's kind of start to look at the timeline of this project, and where, let's go over the MSBA process. And it's a very complex process, and even though Stoughton has made some important progressions, it's still in very early stages, I think. Yes. It's important to stress, of this project, where Stoughton has passed the eligibility phase and now into the feasibility study. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, technically we're actually in the forming of the project team because we haven't brought on the architect yet. Mm-hmm. The architect will be coming on in May. There is, as your graphic shows, there's 8 steps in the process. We're in step 2, construction is step 7, so there is a fairly lengthy process to go through to get to construction. The 2 main parts of the project from the MSBA standpoint is the feasibility and schematic design, which is next. The feasibility study is module 3 or step 3, and schematic design step 4. At that point is when Stoughton will say, this is a project we're going to move forward with, and the MSBA says this is one we're going to participate in. And then after that, we begin the process of detailed design, final design, construction, and closeout. So those 2 main phases, if you will, form the bulk of the MSBA process. Right now, we are commencing the feasibility study phase. We're forming the project team, but we have started the feasibility study phase in some ways. So we will determine in this phase, the feasibility schematic design phase, exactly what project we're going to build, whether it's a new project or an addition or in renovation, the size of the project, what the floor plan would look like, what the layout would look like, the mechanical systems and the electrical systems and security and technology and all those components. Obviously, the cost comes out of this project, what the project total will cost. And we work with the MSBA about exactly what their reimbursement will pick up. The MSBA reimburses whatever Stoughton's percentage is of eligible reimbursable costs. They don't necessarily reimburse every cost. So that's part of the process we're ending up with now.
With the feasibility study, as we switch off the slide, as you mentioned, that there's a number of different factors that will be looked at. Building location, certainly one of them. Where does that fall kind of in the process of, is that where you kind of just, you have to find a place to put the building, or is it determining whether the building is you can renovate it or start from scratch? Kind of like where does, in the process of the feasibility study, where does that come in play?
So you look at multiple options right in the beginning. So the first part of it, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about it when we get into it, is we're going to develop what those options are, whether it's new or additions and renovations. And oftentimes with high schools, there are multiple versions of additions and renovations. So those are sort of determined right now. We are beginning that process right now with the building committee. That's something that we can do without having an architect on board, at least put, if you will, the menu out there of what the options would be. So you don't look at one and then the other. You look at all of them at the same time, because the MSBA, and one of the things I want to be clear about, this is a collaborative process with the MSBA. We work hand in hand with them all throughout the process, and they have to buy into what we're doing. It's not just simply a matter of a district saying, this is what we want to do. If it doesn't meet their requirements for what they're looking for in a school, they won't allow or they won't participate in a project that doesn't meet their requirements. So we work with them, and they make you compare them on a comparative scale, compare the different options. So that is kind of the primary first thing we do in the feasibility phase, is we look at the number of options that we try to determine the number of options, and we look at the criteria against which those will be evaluated. And that's something the building committee will determine and vote on, is how do they want to measure these options? Cost, schedule, time, impact to students, that sort of list of criteria. And that all happens in the feasibility phase.
And I know that there have been opportunities to take tours of the building. Many of the viewers watching this program now have gone to Stoughton High School. But still, TJ or Tim, you just could give me a rundown of the condition right now of Stoughton High School as it stands today.
Well, I took the tour myself with Julie Miller, and it's remarkable how she can rattle off issues as you walk down the hallway, everything from water damage. If you drive by the high school right now on Pearl Street and you look at that building depending on how you're going, going towards Canton on your left, you can actually see the brick bowing out, which was one of the things that first struck me on how remarkable the building was at points failing. We had a meeting there a couple weeks ago, and the heat went from extremes of sauna to freezing cold, because it's just an old, actually 3 different components are all old, and the kids know it too. When I took a tour, the kids actually knew why we were there, and they were pointing things out while we were there too. You could see all sorts of issues: water damage, brick damage, and science facilities was actually one of the big things. We have, and maybe Tim knows this better than I do, I'm not sure, but because this gets cited quite a bit by the school people on the committee, is that we have insufficient science facilities to have just meet basic requirements for science teaching in high school.
Lab.
Right, lab space and the like.
Yep.
So.
I mean, as an example on the science is a big push by the Mass School Building, and by the Department of Education is a big push in terms of educational future and focus. And they have mandated, and they are pretty not relenting on this, that you have 1,400 square foot science labs. I don't know exactly the science labs currently in Stoughton High School, but I'm guessing if they're like a lot of built in that vintage, they're probably 1,000 square feet or less. So there's the kind of discussion when you look at, we need to get 1,440 square foot science labs as part of what the MSBA and the Department of Education requires. In terms of the condition of the school, obviously there's a lot of anecdotal. Stoughton has done a lot of work on what some of the issues are in the school. But that's also something that we will be doing in this feasibility phase, and the architect, when they're on board, will do a complete existing conditions analysis. That's one of the first things we develop as part of the first submission we send to the MSBA.
So going back to the timeline, if you can just give me estimates of on the MSBA building process slide, where we would be date-wise at each of the phases. So right now, you're forming the project team, which would include hiring the architect.
Yeah.
So when do you expect that to be concluded?
So if you put up the timeline, I can walk that.
Sure. We'll put up the designer.
Designer, yep.
Designer slide.
So so we are in the process of designer selection, which we're anticipating will be completed. Actually, it'll be early May now. We've coordinated that with the Mass School Building Authority. Their designer selection panel picks the architect. Stoughton has a say in that, but it's an MSBA decision. That'll happen in early May. The development and evaluation of alternatives will happen basically through the summer and into September. What we would hope to do is our first submission, which is that submit PDP, is the preliminary design report, which is a staff-approved report. It's not a board-approved report at the MSBA, but that is where you lay out the existing conditions of the current facility. You focus on an educational plan, which is the administration and the educators' plan for the building and how they want to teach a high school curriculum and how would the space best support that. It also is where you do discuss the alternatives that we're looking at for the school. So that would wrap up in the fall, beginning of the fall of 2015.
So you're talking about the feasibility and as far as the schematic design, right?
Yeah,
Fall of 2015.
Not the schematic design.
Okay,
that's
just
a separate, just the
feasibility
feasibility
study. Yep.
That feasibility phase technically would wrap up under this current schedule, and I want to just make a quick point on that. Is scheduled to wrap up hopefully with a submission to the board in October for their board meeting in November. Then at that point, the board would say, you have picked the right, we agree with the option you have picked, and we now will move into schematic design at that point. So that feasibility phase would end under the current schedule in November of 2015. The one thing that I just want to make sure people are aware of is that these are all MSBA board decisions. The board meets every 2 months roughly, and you have to have your report into them 6 weeks before the board meeting. So it's and these are a very fluid discussion. We may find that the building committee wants to reevaluate something or look at something a little more detailed. So if we miss one window, we lose 2 months into the next window, and I just want that to be clear because and we talked to the building committee about it. This is it's good to have a very aggressive reach schedule, but it does, this is a dynamic process, and we need to be flexible on that.
Right. So you're pretty much looking towards the end of 2015.
Yes.
Through the rest of this year to do. Realistically, the feasibility study determine where the school will be, whether it's renovated or rebuilt. Now, just roughly speaking then, when would ground break using this timeline, assuming that there's no hitches along the way?
Well, if it moves to the direction of a decision in the end of the 2015, then we move into schematic design, which is it's about a third of the design process. And schematic design takes us into will take us into the late spring. We'll be working with the MSBA to get an approval of that schematic design.
You're talking late spring 2016.
16,
right.
Yeah. But now remember, this is only a third of the design process.
Right.
And that process will, at the conclusion of that is when the MSBA board and the town vote that yes, here is what it will cost. You have to do that much design to really know what it will cost.
And now that's not to interrupt, but that's literally the $100 million question.
That'll be the $100 million question.
And so I'm going to ask TJ about this. There's many different projects in town going on right now, and $100 million is roughly what the cost of the operating budget proposed for this upcoming fiscal year is. Right. You're obviously not going to fund it through an operating budget. So what does this town need to do in order to afford a project that's this costly?
Likely it would go to a vote by the voters for a debt exclusion. That's the most likely scenario.
And that's excluding the 2.5?
The 2.5 cap that we have. So
for just this project?
For just this project, as opposed to a general 2.5 override, which would be a general budget override, and it would stick.
Right. And now that means that once this debt has been paid off for however many number of years, it would go back to being capped by 2.5. That's the difference between the exclusion and the override.
That's right.
And I mean, where do you place as the chairman of the Selectmen right now this project in terms of the town's priorities going forward?
I think this is the #1 priority we have for the foreseeable future. This is the one driver. Look, the schools generally are the biggest drivers of community spirit, community property values, of anything that identifies Stoughton as a community that people want to live and do business in. All relates back to the schools, and particularly the high school. When people move out of town, they don't go online, they don't check how their local convenience store is doing, and they don't check how IKEA sales are doing. They check how their high school teams are doing and how their high school teachers, where they are, and how the students in Stoughton High are faring in the world. It's just the nature of it. So as the schools go, so goes the town. And ours is not serving us well right now. Whether it's a renovation or a new high school, we're going to get it right.
And so going back to the timeline, Tim, funding the project, when, again, assuming everything would be going smoothly, and this is just estimating at this point, when would voters be asked to make a decision about that?
The current timeline shows that we are expecting to come in front of the voters in the spring of 2016. As I mentioned, if it gets pushed, the MSBA is very slow in the summer. It could easily get pushed to the fall of 2016. But right now, the current timeline and what we're working with in terms of a schedule is the spring of 2016.
So therefore, again, construction using the same disclaimer that this is just a long-term estimate. When would ground be breaking?
If the design of a project of this size, once it's approved by the town, is roughly and the bidding of it is roughly a 10-month process. So it's conceivable that ground could start breaking in the summer of the following year, spring, summer of the following year.
So we're talking 2017.
17, yep.
And so with about a minute left in the show, just opportunity for final thoughts and before we wrap up.
Well, I will speak for Compass and for our team that's involved in the project. This is a very exciting project for us. I mean, we have just finished, we've been involved in 3 high schools in the past 4 years. 2 of them are new schools in Marshfield and Norwood. The Norwood High School project is the same exact population count as what Stoughton's would be. We've also been involved in a very extensive addition and renovation project for the Norfolk County Agricultural High School. So high schools are a very interesting environment because they're like mini colleges. They bring on a lot of different program to it. And we find that they generate, obviously, an awful lot of interest within the town. So from our perspective, working with this committee, which is exceptionally talented, we find, and well represented, it's just an exciting opportunity. And I don't know if TJ has any final thoughts. Our time's running out.
Yes, well, real quick.
I think he said it well. There's nothing I can add to it other than we look forward to more of this, by the way. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Always welcome back to keep everybody updated. And again, this project, it's in the beginning steps, but certainly making progress with the possibility of a new Stoughton High School down the road. So thank you for tuning in. I'm Jeffrey Pickette, host of Stoughton Spotlight. I want to thank TJ and Tim for joining me, and I also want to thank our crew, Michael Hammond and CJ Mullen. Thanks for tuning in.